Welcome everybody to 1 + 1 = 1, Better Due Diligences for Hybrid Assets, a webinar hosted by AFRY. And today we will be excited to talk to you all about hybrid assets and how to improve due diligences of this new and exciting but complex asset class. So moving forward, I think first thing we'll do is go through a brief round of introductions. First of all, who are we? We are AFRY. AFRY Group is a specialized consulting and engineering services company that works from strategy to execution across many industries, but today particularly we're talking about the energy industry and in particular renewables and battery energy storage. We see ourselves as the trusted advisor for the business of renewables. Our services and our work with clients spans transactions, which we're talking about today, as well as improving the performance of individual assets, portfolios, and platforms in the renewable space, supporting execution of projects, and also we are well known for making projections about the market in terms of prices, capture rates, gross margins for batteries, as well as ad hoc projections about what the future looks like for this asset class. This is something that we do all over the world, and we are proud to be recognized by some of the leading consultancy awards groups for our support to our clients in this sector. Today on the line, we have myself. My name is Ethan Doyle. I'm based in Hamburg, and I lead the onshore renewables industry practice. My job is to make sure that all of Management Consulting's offerings are pointed towards our clients in the energy space, particularly in the renewable space, where I lead our PV and onshore wind practice across the world. We have as well on the line who will be introducing themselves as they go along, Maria Garcia, who is a renewables transaction services lead based in our Madrid office, and Jonathan Sistonen, who is the VP and head of renewables and energy storage in the Nordics based in Finland. So today we will be covering a lot of topics in this webinar, but the 4 things that we want you to learn is, first of all, what are we talking about when we're talking about hybrids and co-located assets? And what are the details that matter when we're looking at constructing, building, owning, and operating these assets? Second, we want to learn about why and where hybrid assets are gaining traction, which includes which markets are leading in this space, and where are the markets where we see more and more deals popping up on our profiles here at AFRY. Finally, we'll share some recent lessons learned from deals that we've done in Spain, Germany, and the Nordics, where we're very active in transactions, and we'll also pass through those case studies. We'll pass through some knowledge that we've gained as to how to better structure the diligence process from planning all the way through transaction execution, hopefully sharing some lessons learned that you all can use on your next due diligence or the next time that you're looking at deals in this asset class. So let's start with defining what we're talking about, which is hybrid projects. Hybrid projects right now mean a combination of renewable generation technology, so for the purposes of this call, PV and onshore wind, with battery energy storage, which typically is lithium-ion BESS systems. They tend to share close proximity, so they're located relatively close to one another, and they share a grid connection point. However, under that, there are many different types of configurations, depending on where you are, what your asset is doing, that make pretty significant differences in terms of the business case, the regulation, the integration of these assets. Things that are important include whether you're located in proximity towards one another, so the storage asset and the generation asset are directly next to each other, or whether the storage asset is actually closer to the grid connection point. There is a lot of complexity around how the control concepts of these assets work, whether you're controlling and metering them jointly or separately, And those also often correlate with regulatory classifications, such as here in Germany, whether you are selling, quote, green or gray or mixed power, depending on the configuration that you have, the metering setup and the control setup you have. In terms of what we're looking at in terms of an asset class, generally speaking, we see that standalone batteries and standalone BESS today are very, very well known, very, very well transacted assets. And across many, many markets, obviously there's a broad range of rates of return and profitability. But generally speaking, what we're seeing in renewables is that there is a variance in return due to cannibalization, risk returns offtake that are dragging the renewables returns profiles down slightly compared to standalone batteries. Hybrid assets, in terms of their returns profile, fit somewhere in between here, where the way that they are configured can tilt them more towards the direction of a BESS-like returns profile if you're trading across multiple value streams and you're trying to engage in multiple different markets on a merchant basis, or they can look much more like a standalone feed-in tariff res type of project where you have a specific tariff for a specific project's output. This depends on a wide variety of factors, including the subsidy support scheme that you're in, the regulatory benefits within the country, the offtake and route to market that's available to your asset based on where it is and how it works, the technical configurations, how and where you're recognizing CapEx and DevEx efficiencies, and how your financing is put together to build this asset. So in summation, while this webinar really isn't about which configuration and where you get the most returns for each asset type, we're happy to have those discussions, and it's something we do a lot with our clients. But today we're really talking about this asset class as a whole and where the differences lie. And of course, with any renewables or energy asset, the markets are really, really local and important at the country level to look at how we see these markets evolving. And so when we look at what makes hybrids attractive and what's drawing interest into this segment, we see that there are three main causes. The first is the market price driver of renewables assets is making the renewables returns profile less valuable, less viable in many markets due to cannibalization or overcrowding of the market. The second is that there are system needs that are not being fulfilled by renewables and conventionals, leaving what we call a flexibility gap, where the system requires more flexible assets that can respond to price or supply signals in the market. And in order to pull in new flexible assets, there are countries that are creating new offtake support mechanisms specifically designed for hybrid assets. Finally, there are challenges of grid stability. There's rising congestion. There are challenges to the grid itself. And as a response to that, there are reforms that are benefiting co-located projects, providing regulatory benefits such as improved permitting procedures, improved grid connection procedures, or improved ability to take advantage of various programs such that the grid can benefit and become more stable as a result of where these assets go into effect. So if we look at these as evaluation criteria, the merchant case, the subsidy support schemes, and the regulatory benefits, we can do a qualitative assessment of where are the countries where hybrid assets are currently making the most difference, and where are the countries that are up and coming where we think that in the future hybrid assets will be more important to the mix. And let's first look at the merchant case. And so where are there countries where hybrid assets alone just on the basis of the merchant revenues, are gaining traction, getting deals signed, and reaching project finance close or operations. And here we have the case of kind of three segments of the market. The leading countries are countries that have deep PPA markets from traditional renewables assets or batteries, and players who can find a hybrid premium in deals with hyperscalers or with large industrials. And we're seeing these countries lead the way in terms of closing new hybrid deals on either a fully merchant or a contracted PPA basis on the basis of the fundamental economics of the projects alone. Then under that, we have some up and coming markets where we're seeing a lot of interest in profile risk management and in protecting assets, either operating or pipeline assets, from the future risks that of cannibalization and congestion. However, they don't have both the depth in the PPA markets or strong enough economic case to scale this asset class right now. But we expect there to be improvements to this outlook as we look forward into the future. And then, of course, there are some markets where there is slower adoption on the basis of the economic profile of hybrid assets alone not being particularly beneficial for reasons that we'll discuss later. Then we look at subsidy supports. So the question here is, where are there countries that have specific supports that are designed with hybrid assets in mind? Where are there countries where other support schemes might tangentially benefit hybrid assets, or at least not take away from the value of a subsidy that might be presented only to a battery or only to renewables when those two things are put together, versus there are finally countries where actually combining two assets for certain regulatory, grid, or permitting reasons makes the asset actually worse off than if you were to develop two standalone assets. In the lead, we have Greece and Germany, who both have very defined support schemes that are targeted specifically at hybrid assets. So this is, for instance, in Germany, the Inner-Ostg auction, which provides a single tariff towards co-located, predominantly storage and solar projects. And so this is creating a market for hybrid assets themselves as a packaged standalone product. We then have a number of countries where there are individual support mechanisms that hit maybe the solar or the battery project, where you don't have the issue of the takeaway from the other project. And then finally, there are projects in countries such as Ireland or such as Ireland, where they actually suffer from operational constraints if they have both the storage and the battery co-located. And of course, there are many markets such as those in the Nordics where there are just no subsidies whatsoever for renewables, and they have to operate on a merchant basis. Finally, when we look at regulatory benefits, we see countries that are leading the pack in terms of prioritizing hybrids, giving them additional statutory rights, the ability to jump the queue, prioritize dispatch, or specialized treatment and cable pooling. Then there are other up-and-coming markets that are giving either strategic access or flexible grid connections that help maybe retrofit the projects where existing grid connections already exist. And then finally, there are slow-to-adopt countries that have not made as much progress in any of these areas. So if we were to look at segmenting the market as a whole, we can look at four different categories that we have. First of all, we have the trailblazers. These are countries like Spain and Greece that have high certainty and high velocity and large pipelines of co-located assets reaching financing or looking for financing, reaching financing, and coming into operations in the next few years. These projects are characterized by the economic necessity of batteries and also by a repeatable structure for offtake that the market is coalescing around. Next, we have the next frontiers, which include Germany, the UK, Poland, and Denmark. These are places with high growth and the first transactions being signed, mostly on the strength of the PPA market in the case of the UK, or the InnoAusG in the case and the PPA market in the case of Germany, or in the case of Denmark, the cable pooling ability and the strength of certain off-takers. And so we see here regulatory momentum, scaling volumes, and commercial innovation around these deals. Then there are emerging markets such as some of the Nordic markets, as well as Portugal and the Netherlands, where there is high potential. We are seeing the first projects being put together, but play is still mostly opportunistic and not quite yet at industrial scale. And then finally, we have a number of countries that are much slower to adopt. Either they have legacy-dominated systems or a standalone mindset that creates friction when you're combining these two assets. And what we also see is that when we're looking across the markets where we are experiencing activity and working with clients on co-location and hybrids, we're seeing that these due diligence processes pay off from a single integrated project view. So really understanding, rather than understanding this asset class as a solar or a wind farm plus a battery, really trying to understand and shape the diligence process around understanding the asset class as a singular unit. And now I will pass it over to my colleague Maria to first introduce herself, and then as the head of one of the leads of the transaction service line, she will talk more about transactions and how to diligence hybrid assets. Maria, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you. A quick intro on my side. I am Maria Garcia, Senior Principal. I am based in the Madrid office. I am part, as Ethan said, I am part of the transaction service team. This means I participate constantly in due diligences in the framework of M&A and financing processes, mainly focus on the technical side of things. Here, the aim of this section is to present main tips and considerations that need to be taken when performing a DD for an hybrid asset. Messages shared here will be further explained in the case studies. But first, what is a DD? In our view, DD is much more than the instrument you need to use to tick the box for the investment committee. From our point of view, when a DD is well done, it can add really value. They are not only used for buy assets, they can also help you to shape your strategy in a country or in a region. A good DD gives you a clear picture of the risks of the deal, and especially where the higher risks is located, whether it is commercial, technical, regulatory, etc. It is not about understanding the project specific or the asset itself. It is about understanding the biggest context and how things might evolve in the future. DDs can also give you insight of what is the seller's need, and this can be used from your side as a big advantage for negotiating, or even can help you to win the deal. Also, on the sell side, the DDs can help you to maximize your value by presenting different business cases that matches the investor strategy. At the end of the day, what we want to say here in this webinar is that an integrated DD is what makes the deal stronger. Next slide. Okay, going back to hybrid assets, as Ethan said, hybrid assets are complex, and understanding the complexity in terms of commercial, regulatory, and technical, it is key for a successful DD. That is why in this webinar, as I said, we want to launch the idea, two main ideas. Hybrid assets should be considered as unique asset class, and also a solid DD is the one that is integrated. Here I would like to mention 4 main challenges that are typically seen in the DDs that I am sure most of the audience already have them identified. The first one is prepare. DD are typically tight in terms of timing, of course. So being prepared and having prior experience on the assessment of this kind of assets in terms of regulatory, commercial, technical, it is key. Scoping, make sure the different work streams cover all the gaps, and in some cases, make sure they overlap. The more communication between the different work streams, the better to reduce the risk of the transaction. Diligence. Of course, we all know that in most cases, projects look better in the paper than in reality, because there are some risks that are uncertain, and there are some risks that cannot be factored in the financial model so easily. So make sure that you combine the project-specific assessment with the macro or national level view to ensure you are capturing the current situation of the project at the transaction moment, but also you are also capturing or being preparing for future financing processes and exits. And finally, execute. In line with the previous point, make sure the project is resilient enough to survive potential regulation and technology changes that always happen. And if possible, quantify these potential changes. So now, moving to the case studies, I'm going to present the first one. This case study pretends to illustrate the grid and regulatory bottlenecks for hybrid projects. In this case, we participated in a buy-side DD where the target strategy consisted on hybridizing existing renewable projects with BESS projects, with battery projects. Spanish regulation is moving towards incentivizing hybrid assets. In the case of Spain, the 3 main permits that we have, which are grid, environmental, and administrative permits, can be simplified for hybrid assets, and especially for battery projects. In the case of grid and generation capacity permit, only an update of the previous permit is needed. In the case of environmental permit, if the BESS project is located within the polygon of the original technology, there is no need for a new environmental approval. On the contrary, if it is outside, it is needed. However, the procedure can be simplified as well. In the case of administrative permits, more or less the same. The time responses from the administration can be reduced even by half for hybrid assets. Of course, for these kind of projects to benefit from these fast tracks, they need to comply with some requirements. the one related to environmental, I already mentioned. Regarding the main requirement related to grid is related to the size of the battery. The original technology should be more than 40% of the granted capacity. This is a good example in which the market advisor and the technical advisor should consider the local regulation in order to either size the battery or validate the size of the battery. In this particular case, in this particular portfolio, the projects were at very early stages. So they only have initiated the grid request, the grid permit, the capacity request. So there was no final layout or technical configuration. AFRY could, based on our previous experience and knowledge of this kind of asset, we could verify that the target strategy was in line with the permitting route, and therefore we could validate in this case the ready to build and COD dates, which of course impact on the evaluation. In addition to that, best projects need as well to request demand capacity in order to be able to operate efficiently in the markets, in the auxiliary markets. This is a separate process from the operating asset. Demand capacity is quite local, and it really depends on two main factors: availability of capacity at a given node or connection point, but also interest from other developers for the same node. In the case of Spain, it is worth mentioning that the interest, the demand capacity requests have increased considerably in the last years because of the potential for BESS, data centers, etc. In the case of this portfolio, again, the projects were at very early stages, so we didn't have access to the response from the TSO, the DSO. So we don't have a clear view from the seller, let's say, on how this is going to evolve. AFRY could verify these two aspects, availability and interest, from other developers, and we could categorize the projects into the three possible alternatives that are presented in Spain. The first one, it is that the demand request is approved. In this case, no risks. Second alternative, demand request is on hold because there is available capacity, but the capacity is reserved for contest. And the third alternative, demand request is rejected because there is no demand capacity available. Based on these results, AFRY took two actions. The first one, of course, is the technical advisor to communicate with the market one, with the commercial one, which in this case was AFRY as well, and align on the revenues to be included in the financial model because of this hybridization. Also, AFRY commented or validated the timings included in the financial model. The second action was the following. The fact that the demand request is on hold or the fact that the demand request is rejected doesn't mean this possibility is eliminated forever. So in this case, it is quite important to combine both the project-specific assessment with the current situation with the macro view or national level view to look into the future. In this case, again, we collaborated with both advisors, commercial and technical, collaborated and come up with a number of sensitivities that can be considered in the financial model, considering based on our view on whether it is feasible for this capacity to be released, when it is uncertain or not, etc. So just to close this case study, it is crucial to ensure that the project location and technical design it is in line with the permitting route. It is also crucial to confirm the demand capacity is available for best projects. And the last point, it is crucial to communicate with the other advisors just to ensure the financial model is consistent. Therefore, providing an integrated DD approach. And now I leave the floor to my colleague, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Maria, and thanks, Ethan. So, hi everyone, lovely to be here today. As Ethan mentioned at the start, my name is Jonathan Sistinen, and I head our renewables and energy storage in the Nordics, and I'm located in Vantaa in Finland. So let me walk you through our second case study, which is an example from the Nordics and a very good illustration of why proper due diligence is not just a box-ticking exercise, but a real value creation tool, especially when it comes to hybrid assets. So this case is based on a late-stage hybrid project in a Nordic country, and it combined operating wind assets, a planned solar farm, and a co-located battery energy storage system, or a BESS. Now, from the outside, this looked like a relatively straightforward project. There's a strong developer, it's a good location, there's an existing grid infrastructure, and a market that's generally considered stable and bankable. But as we often say with hybrids, the devil is in the interfaces. And from a due diligence perspective, the key question really wasn't whether each individual asset would work on its own, but whether the full hybrid system worked as one cohesive solution, both technically, commercially, and from a grid and a regulatory standpoint. One of the first things that the due diligence that we performed helped clarify was how tightly coupled these assets really were. And in this project, the BESS was connected at a medium voltage level to an existing wind farm substation, where it shared the grid capacity with both the wind and then future solar assets to be coupled into the same location. Now, that immediately raises important questions around congestion, curtailment, and operational priorities. And on paper, sharing infrastructure is always quite efficient, but in practice, it does introduce quite a lot of complexity as well. The due diligence then allowed us to find out information that helped our client to clearly understand when and how the BESS might be constrained, and in particular during periods of high renewable output, often the exact same moments when flexibility and reserve revenues are the most valuable. And this is where a proper due diligence really adds value. It doesn't just flag a specific risk, it frames the operational question correctly and helps in the understanding of it. And here the solution wasn't just more hardware, it was a question of governance, control philosophy, and an overarching hybrid controller that could manage these different priorities dynamically rather than setting that up through rigid rules. And another critical area that the due diligence uncovered was the interface risk between contractors and suppliers. And during the process, we did identify different discrepancies between both the supplier's best design and the balance of plant contractors' documentation. Things like number of power conversion units, transformer configurations, etc. And these are not only academic details, as if these are left unresolved, they can lead to different gaps in scope, quite quickly turn into cost overruns or disputes during the construction. And the due diligence helped surface these questions and issues early, while they were still easy and most importantly, still very inexpensive to fix. And for our client, then this meant moving into the transaction phase with a much clearer understanding of what needed to be aligned contractually before moving towards the financial close. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention permitting, because permitting is another great example. And this project, from a high-level perspective, it was fully permitted and followed the standard national practices. But when we dived into the diligence, it showed that fully permitted doesn't necessarily always mean zero risk. And there were minor deviations found between the permitted layouts and the final technical designs needed for confirmation from the authorities. So catching this early avoided the risk of possible severe delays or even a re-permitting process, which then could be a question of years, and avoided that in total at a much later and critical stage of the project. And that was really important, a really important lesson to be learned, that not always does it turn out to be what it seems. So in total, what was the outcome then? So if we look at the end of the work and the due diligence, the customer ended up having something extremely valuable. There was a new, clear and structured view of the real risk that mattered in this hybrid project. Not theoretical risks, but practical ones with interfaces, grid behavior, control strategy, and execution readiness that were unearthed and risks that were avoided. And in the end, then, this allowed the seller to present the asset in a much more transparent way. It reduced the uncertainty for both parties, and especially then, of course, for potential investors. And it strengthened the project's whole bankability and transaction readiness. And in other words, then the due diligence didn't slow the process down. Instead, it made it stronger and made it a more viable and time-saving exercise for both parties. And I think that is the real key takeaway here. We have to remember then also that hybrid assets are not just wind plus solar plus BESS. They are their own asset classes, Ethan already also mentioned, and they do have their own risk profile. And this is where due diligence really helps in moving away from possible optimistic assumptions made and go towards a situation of more informed decisions that both protect and preserve value and reduce the unpleasant possibilities of surprises in the end. So, and that ultimately is what a good due diligence should do as well. So, with that said, thanks from my side, and I'm going to hand over to Ethan.
Thanks, Jonathan. And one of the things that really resonated that you just said was how a good transaction process, a good diligence makes the deal stronger. And that's something that we're always trying to do when we are working with clients to shape the process, either before, during, or after a due diligence that we're on. And so this next case study, which is one from Germany, is around understanding optionality in the developer case and where there are no regrets choices or two-way doors, choices that you can make that keep your options open rather than closing certain pathways. And as in other countries, Germany has a complex set of new regulatory designations for what type of co-location you are conducting, whether it's green, gray, or mixed. And each of those power colors needs to be tracked separately from one another in order to qualify for certain subsidy schemes or in order to achieve certain regulatory benefits. And so in the case of Germany, the best way forward in terms of what assets have the highest return is to be trading across all of these assets and to have a battery that can be moving across these assets, plus all of the ancillary markets, intraday markets, so that the battery is not just trading power from the renewables, but also engaging directly with the grid as a whole and trading across multiple products. However, at the same time, there are requirements for a battery to be able to operate in this way, which, similar to Spain, requires a separate grid connection agreement for the infeed to the battery, the demand side of the battery. These often, increasingly here in Germany, are regulated by flexible connection agreements with the DSO. And some of these flexible connection agreements have conditions that can hinder or outright kill the economics of the battery, such as ramping constraints, such as discharge and state of charge requirements, or scheduling requirements that significantly impact the ability for the battery to respond and trade across all markets. And so one of the key issues for co-location today is that the configuration that works today and has the best business case today might not be bankable tomorrow, might need more requirements tomorrow. And so when we're working on a recent transaction with a developer who was looking to build and sell a pipeline of mid to late stage projects with co-located batteries, we help them understand where are the optionality points, or the points where you can preserve optionality throughout the development process, and where the no regrets decisions, such as making sure that your metering and grid forming infrastructure is in place across any of the development pathways you choose, such that you don't reduce your options later on in terms of what the battery or what the asset in its entirety can and can't do. And what we did as a result of this, or how we helped as a result of this, was to put together not only a case for what the most optimized business case on paper looks like, but also to make sure that the developer and later buyers understand where are the inflection points, and where are the times where you need to make a final decision or let go of optionality and kind of lock into one approach or another. And so I think if we were to summarize across all of these three case studies that we've discussed, there are some common themes that come up. If we go back to Maria's kind of description of what a diligence is and the stage of diligences, we see that there are challenges that hybrids present to each one of these phases. And we hope that through this webinar, we have equipped you with both key questions that we hope that you can answer as you're within this phase of the deal, and then also our recommendations for using our experience to strengthen your approach to make your transactions more efficient, more, let's say, less intense in terms of timeline or hours, and then ultimately more successful in terms of being able to create a or conduct a diligence that uncovers key findings and or leads to a successful transaction. And so when we're looking at preparing for a diligence, obviously the understanding that hybrids are a different asset class is something we really want to come across here. And the key question that you ought to be asking yourself as an investor in this phase is, what are the types of assets that work for my goals as an investor? What are the returns profiles that I'm interested in? What are the cash flow profiles that I'm interested in? And what are the risks that I'm willing to or not willing to take as a way to develop, own, or operate these projects? And so our recommendation is to understand upfront the details and characteristics of these assets and understand where in this field you want to play, so that when you're learning about the intricacies of the configurations and the connection between regulatory, technical, and market questions, you're not all learning this on the fly the first time in the middle of a high-intensity transaction environment. The next set of questions or challenges comes from scoping. So obviously we talked a lot about how there are overlaps between the different work streams, which risk creating blind spots or handoffs where not all of the work gets done, or perhaps there are different views across different work streams, or in worst case scenario, something that needs to get picked up doesn't get picked up at all. And so the key questions that you ought to be asking during this scoping phase is, what are the intersection points that we need to cover? Where are the likely overlaps between the commercial and the technical workstream? And then strengthening your approach by integrating, either by using the same advisor or by creating intentional touch points between advisors, so that commercial, market, regulatory, and technical work streams all work together as one in order to deliver a scope and an assessment that encapsulates the entire risk profile of the asset. Finally, during the diligence phase, we want to make sure that we understand the risks that we can and can't model. And this goes back to many of the points that Maria and Jonathan were making, focusing on bankability, executability, and exit readiness, which means focusing not just on how to make the numbers in the model go as high as possible, but really understanding what are the risks that we can and can't model, and how do they match towards something that we can bring into real life. And then finally, when we're in execution of the transaction, it's important to know that regulations and the technologies are always changing. And so how can you understand where your case is resilient or exposed to different market changes? And what we think that many of our clients can do to strengthen this approach is to actively track the market and work with teams that are active in both the kind of high-level economic forecasting level of the market, but also deep into the details of projects and delivery, so that you get an integrated view of how, let's say, policy is implementing the way that projects are being delivered out into the field. And so that brings us to the end of our webinar, and close to opening up the questions. So if there are questions that you have, I hope that you all have been adding them into the Q&A tab, and I'll go through a brief summary before we open up the floor for questions. So we hope that you learned 4 things during this webinar. The first is that hybrids are a new asset class that combine the complexities of standalone BESS, standalone renewables, plus their own complexities around configuration, around design, around interface, and around commercial and regulatory challenges. Second, we hope that you learned that there are markets where there are a lot of transactions happening for hybrid assets today, and more markets in the future that will continue to grow in this space. There are the trailblazing markets of Spain and Greece, where almost every renewables deal that we see is a hybrid deal. There are the frontiers of Germany, the UK, Poland, and Denmark, where we're seeing an increased volume of hybrids. And then there are the emerging markets like Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Portugal, where we're starting to see the first transactions appear, and we think that there's room to scale pretty significantly across these 3 types of markets. We hope that you heard from our case studies about how to improve transactions and things that worked in Spain, looking at uncovering bottlenecks, in the Nordics, looking at overcoming integration risk, and in Germany, talking about preserving optionality through the development process. And then finally, we hope that you take 4 recommendations from us for your next due diligence. The first is understand the deals and the asset classes before you jump into your first hybrid deal. The second is, to the extent possible, reduce the workstream handoff risks and integrate across multiple work streams. The third is to make sure that you're focusing on bankability, executability, and exit, not just the way to maximize the financial model and pull it away farther away from reality. And then finally, expect the market to keep changing as these assets become more and more popular, and work with teams that are taking both the very, very deep technical view as well as a macro view on the market and regulation. And once again, my name is Ethan Doyle. I was happy to be joined today by Maria Garcia and Jonathan Sistonen, and we are very, very happy to be serving this industry through AFRY's renewable industry practice, where we hope to work together with all of you soon. So in that case, I think we can open the floor up for questions, and perhaps Edwin, you want to read off a question or two that we've received while we were delivering this webinar?
Yeah, sure. I'll just put the first one in the chat. So the first one is, how can any developers ensure the right sizing of hybrid assets with many variables like limited import capacity, dynamic grid restrictions, etc.? This seems to be increasingly difficult.
Right. Okay. Well, I'd like to start that. It is a tricky question. And you know, with anything, ensuring the right size of your assets totally depends on what kind of other challenges you're facing. What is the strategy that your company has? What are you looking at in the long term? Are you playing only in the reserve market, or are you also helping out and making sure that the grid is stable? What's your timeline looking like? Which market are you playing in? It is really, really, really difficult. And I think that's where it is really crucial to have a proper strategy set out from the get-go, to understand the different factors that play into each market. Where might there be issues with the grid? And if you're purchasing assets, that's where due diligence especially comes in, for you to understand all these risks and how they relate to your portfolio as a whole. So it is a nearly impossible question to answer straight off, because it really requires a lot more information around it to be able to answer. But you know, it really is difficult. Ethan, do you have any better points to take?
I don't have a specific number or golden rule, but what I can say is that this is something that we spend a lot of time with clients working with, because it's really a question of what's the, as Jonathan said, what are the techno-economic inputs and outputs. And so certainly for those of you who are working in this space and are wondering, how can I right size my battery? Should I be working in with a 2, a 4, a longer duration energy storage asset? These are questions that we are using our bid 3 modeling approach and running bespoke models on every day with clients. And this is something that we can spin up for an asset specific calculation pretty quickly. So if there are interests for any of you out there who would like to hear more about this, feel free to contact me or Maria, and we would be more than happy to put you in touch with the right people to run these simulations and help you figure out what the right answer for your projects are.
Great. And then the next one was, how are revenue streams forecast for hybrid projects right now? And where are you seeing the biggest gaps between what sellers present and what investors/lenders accept?
So I think I'll take that one. So like I mentioned, we do a lot of this right now using our proprietary projection software, which is bid 3. And the way that we do that, or at least in the best case, the way that we do that is by looking at the asset specific. So what are all of the technical requirements that the mix of assets has, and how do they relate to one another? Jonathan brought up an important point that sometimes the battery will be wanting to participate in the market at the same time that the sun might be shining and the solar might be exporting. And so understanding how these conditions layer across each other in both a technical and a commercial way is a very, very important exercise to conduct. And it's something that what we see is, I'd say as a general rule, is it's not as easy as just layering a standard battery curve over a standard capture rate curve. But you really ought to be considering, what does my asset's production profile look like based on what markets I'm going to be playing in, what my offtake strategy is, what my contracts look like, and in that case, what we're seeing is a trend towards asset-specific bespoke modeling for each of these assets to really clearly unpack what the revenue curve looks like at an asset level.
Right, and maybe one for Maria as well. How does the O&M of hybrid assets change compared to isolated ones in terms of planning, execution, and cost, etc.?
Okay, thank you, Edwin. The answer is more or less the same as my colleagues, so there is no right answer. Of course, it is a case-by-case analysis, but maybe I can comment on this question from a more general perspective and covering the CAPEX and OPEX differences, because definitely there are some efficiencies when talking about hybrid assets compared to separate to standalone projects. In the case of CAPEX, and especially when you are co-locating and BESS project to an existing renewable project, in the case of CAPEX, of course, there is no efficiency or discount regarding the BESS system, but there can be some efficiencies on the grid connection and the BOP cost. Of course, this really depends on the final configuration, the connection, whether it is DC, AC, etc. But we can see some efficiencies there. Just to provide some numbers, the latest transactions we saw, we are talking about a discount of from 5 to 15%. In the case of OPEX, similar rule applies, which means that there are some efficiencies. Of course, there is no efficiency regarding spare parts or extended warranties for an BESS project that is co-located with a renewable project, but there are some efficiencies as well regarding electrical infrastructure and civil works costs, and also in some cases regarding asset management, there is no efficiency regarding insurance or market agent cost, for example, but in overall, the OPEX of the BESS project, which is co-located, can be between 10 to 20% lower than the standalone project from the latest transactions we've seen in Spain recently.
Thanks, Maria. Now, looking at the clock, it seems we're right at the 29-minute mark. So we hope that you all have enjoyed the webinar, and we hope that this was valuable. Please reach out to us if there are any further questions. If you want the materials, we'll send them out afterwards. And as always, AFRY is more than excited to be supporting this industry, and we look forward to working together with you all shortly.